Welcome back to the Citadel. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to listen to a lecture today about the fragility of ordered liberty, de Tocqueville and the conservative conceptions of liberty, equality, and community. Given the fact we took a look at the American experiment and American tradition, I think this will give us more insight into what the conservative intellectual tradition in America is. Next week, we'll be looking at the New Deal and what that really means to the conservative intellectual tradition. We'll go on to libertarianism and then go on to Reagan, Buckley, and the Cold War. Some of the speakers that will be addressing us with lectures will be General Ed Meese, Art Laffer, Dr. Art Laffer, Secretary Rumsfeld, among others, and we're just thrilled to have them all. Introducing today's lecturer is a member of the Board of Visitors, a distinguished alumnus, and a good friend and a great American, Tom McQueenie.
Well, it's a great day to be in Charleston, and it looks like the hits just keep on rolling. We've got just a wonderful speaker again today. Michael's a political analyst. He's a journalist. He's the principal author of the Almanac of American Politics, along with a number of other wonderful books. He's also a political pundit. He's a regular commentator for Fox News. Some of you may have already seen him there many times. He spent 18 years at the U.S. News and World Report political desk. He's the senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner. He's the editorial writer and columnist for the Washington Post. He's a graduate of Harvard with a law degree at Yale. Generations from now, there will be references and quotations related to his life's work because he is one of the great political minds of this last half century. I give you Michael Barone.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and a special honor to be asked to speak on the fragility of ordered liberty and to speak on Alexis de Tocqueville. And in rereading Tocqueville in preparation for this lecture, I began to think that he was something like Mozart, that I was in the presence of a mind that was so far above the level of almost anyone else in history that he almost brooks no comparison with anybody else. You can listen to the music of Mozart, and it sounds pleasant and melodic and so forth. But if you really think about it, if you really kind of analyze it, you realize that he's doing things no one else had ever done or was capable of doing. That it's so far above the level of ordinary, even impressive achievement that you're in the presence of something rare. And I think you see the same thing with Tocqueville. It's easy to read Tocqueville fairly fast. You're in front of a television set, there's a conversation in the next room, you're starting to think about what you have to do an hour from now, what you have to pick up at the store. And you lose track of the fact that Tocqueville really requires close attention. And when you pay him that close attention, you realize that you're in the presence of somebody extraordinary. And what is interesting about this parallel is that both of these men did their great work as young men. It's a little daunting, perhaps even to a college audience, that Mozart died at age 35, so all that we have from him was written from the time he started composing music at age 6 until his death at age 35. Tocqueville composed the 2 volumes of Democracy in America by the time he was 35. He did other great work later, but if he had died at age 35 on the publication of the 2nd volume of Democracy in America, at that same age that Mozart died, I think we would still know that he was a great man and that he was way above the ordinary level of human achievement, that he has much to teach us today. So let me begin by recalling that on the 11th day of May, 1831, 2 young French aristocrats, Alexis de Tocqueville and his friend Gustave Beaumont, arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, on their way to New York after sailing 38 days from France. They were lawyers with the commission from the French government to study American prisons, which they did. But they did much more, for during the course of his 288 days of travels in the young republic, Tocqueville, who was only 25 years old when he landed, not much older than today's undergraduates, made the observations and accumulated the material which he fashioned in the 2 volumes of Democracy in America, which the political scientist and Tocqueville translator Harvey Mansfield has called the best book ever written on democracy and the best book ever written on America. He conversed with President Andrew Jackson at a reception in the White House, sat next to former President John Quincy Adams at dinner in Boston. He was escorted around Washington by Joel Poinsett, the Charleston-born botanist and future Secretary of War, and by Edward Everett, the Boston-born lawyer and future Secretary of State. He met 95-year-old Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence and the only Catholic to sign that document, and Sam Houston, the future president of the first president of the Republic of Texas. He attended town meetings in New England, observed slave markets in the South. He visited Indian villages in the Michigan Territory, voyaged on steamboats that shortly after he disembarked blew up. It was a highly hazardous form of transportation. He traveled by stagecoach. He went to Columbia, South Carolina. He did not, unfortunately for himself, make it to Charleston. Tocqueville was an aristocrat whose family suffered during the French Revolution. They could trace their heritage back to Norman times, the invasion of William the Conqueror. Some of his ancestors were part of that army. His great-grandfather, Mallory, a distinguished philosopher and lawyer, who was defense counsel in the trial of King Louis XVI, was guillotined months after his client. Tocqueville's father escaped the guillotine only because of the fall of Robespierre 3 days before he was scheduled to be guillotined as well. And when he left the prison at age 22, his hair had turned completely white. This was a family that was traumatized by this great event in history, the French Revolution. As a child, Tocqueville was born in 1805, met the restored King Louis XVIII after the downfall of Napoleon, and while he and his family thrived under Louis, his brother Charles X, and the new bourgeois King Louis Philippe, the specter of bloodshed and tumult of the revolution, the threat of another revolution, was always in their thoughts. And he came from a background which considered the French Revolution a great disaster. In the first lecture in this course, Alfred Regnery recounted how the ideas of American conservatism had roots in 4 cities: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London. Conspicuously absent from this list is Paris, still ruled by a monarch and a centralized bureaucracy with limited powers to a legislature whose members were chosen by a very small electorate. Tocqueville knew before his arrival that America was different. It was something that he wanted to see, that it was a democracy, the word he used in his title. And it was democracy was something that the people in whose circles he lived and his family in which he'd grown up regarded with dread. The young republic had evolved in important ways from the days of the founders. Revolutionary America was still a somewhat deferential society, not an aristocratic society like Europe, but a deferential society. And at the time of the Constitution, most states allowed only those with a certain amount of property to vote. That's why the framers of the Constitution provided that the House of the Representatives should be chosen by the same electorate that chose the most numerous House in the state legislature. That would be as wide a franchise, but not a complete franchise, of all adult male citizens. It was considered dangerous in the British tradition and the American tradition to allow those without property, without a stake in society, to be in a position to determine the course of government. And this is indeed a tradition that comes to us as well from Athens and Rome, where they also felt that the property, people with a stake in society, should have a monopoly on political power and on the vote. But in the first decades of the Republic, as historian Gordon Wood has written, American society became less deferential and more democratic in character. Tocqueville was struck when former President Adams was treated as just another guest at dinner, and he notes in his letters home that he's surprised that he wasn't treated like a monarch. People didn't bow down before him, but simply said hello. By the 1830s, almost all the states, South Carolina was an exception, had extended the vote to all white adult males. Some still resisted, as John Randolph of Roanoke did at Virginia's Constitutional Convention, decrying, quote, the all-prevailing principle that numbers, and numbers alone, are to regulate all things in political society, and the prospect that government was to divorce property from power. He believed that they should be connected and not divorced. But by the time Tocqueville arrived, this was a minority view in Virginia as elsewhere. To most legislators, universal suffrage, limited to adult white males, we obviously do not limit it to whites and to males anymore. We still limit it to adults. The full universal suffrage did not seem so dangerous in a nation where the large majority of people were farmers who owned their own land and who therefore were property holders. For the French aristocrats in Tocqueville's time, however, with their still vibrant dread of the French Revolution, democracy still seemed very dangerous indeed. Tocqueville disagreed, seeing dangers in democracy, but also seeing opportunities and reasons for hope. And he also saw democracy as irresistible, as the wave of the future, as something that was sure to come in some form, good or bad, to Europe, where it would be in conflict with the aristocratic heritage, as it had come into America, which did not have much in the way of an aristocratic heritage to conflict with it. One danger that Tocqueville perceived in democracy was what he called individualism, the tendency of citizens to isolate themselves and withdraw from the larger society when they're not bound together by the relations between aristocrats and their inferiors. The model he had in mind was the Normandy of his, where his family had resided and held property and been ennobled for centuries, where they had obligations to people that lived on their land and people in the vicinity and institutions there, and where the people in turn had obligations to people like the Tocquevilles. They were connected, he thought. They were not equal, but those connections at least existed. And he was afraid that in a democratic society, in a society where all were considered equal, that those relationships would not appear and that they would be replaced by individualism, by the isolation of the individual and not having the connections, the social connections with others. Democracy, he wrote, threatens to confine the citizen so wholly in the solitude of his own heart. But the America, he observed, avoided this danger, he came to believe, because of two important factors. The Americans, he wrote, have combated the individualism to which equality gives birth with freedom, and they have defeated it. He saw this as a very hopeful development. And you can read much of Tocqueville as an instruction to his French relatives and contemporaries about how this system that they were very suspicious of, in fact, was working pretty well, and that the dangers they thought it contained had been avoided. And one of those dangers that had been avoided was individualism. One of the things that helped them avoid that danger was the importance of government and of local governments. At the time of his visit, Americans seldom came into contact with the federal government, with the single exception of the post office. And even that was not always federally ruled. In the decades after Tocqueville came to the United States, postmasters in South Carolina would not transmit abolitionist letters and literature. They simply burned it or destroyed it and would not deliver it to the recipients. But the post office was the main source of federal power. But Americans were of necessity in constant contact with local governments, with the towns of New England, the townships that were spread across the old Northwest Territory, the counties in the South, and being affected by their decisions took advantage of the opportunity to participate in it. Democracy meant that those decisions by local governments were not made simply by those above them, but were made by them and people that they chose. Thus, by charging citizens with the administration of small affairs, much more than by leaving the government of great ones to them, writes Tocqueville, one interests them in the public good and makes them see the need they constantly have for one another in order to produce it. Local freedoms bring men closer to one another. Local freedoms and democracies bring people into contact and establish ties and bonds between them on the basis of equality that were equivalent to or better than the ties that were created between them in the unequal system of aristocracy. And what we see here is an appreciation of the conservative principle which Catholic philosophers refer to as subsidiarity. Instead of a central government superintending local affairs, as was the case in France, and that began, as Tocqueville wrote in his later volume on the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, well before the French Revolution, with the centralizing impulse of Louis XIV, getting rid of local governments and local autonomy, centralizing authority in the king. As Louis XIV once said, "L'État, c'est moi." The state, it's me. I am the government. That France was centralized before the revolution, becomes further centralized by the revolution, which abolishes the ancient provinces and creates the départements, where the superintendents are appointed by the central government in Paris, usually from a list of people as time went on who were educated in certain central universities in Paris. And in fact, government in France still resembles that model in very many ways. That kind of centralization did not, in Tocqueville's view, was something for which he had a considerable dread. And he notes that instead of having that kind of central government, democracy in America tended to let local governments, chosen by people who would remain close to their representatives and be affected by their decisions, have control of all matters that could be handled at that level. The Constitution limited the powers of the federal government. Tocqueville studies intensely the different features of the Constitution, and reserved other matters to the state governments and the people. And the state governments in turn delegated to local matters which could be addressed locally. Now, not every issue could be so delegated, Tocqueville realized. One of the major events during his visit was the nullification crisis, in which the South Carolina legislature, encouraged by Vice President John C. Calhoun, South Carolinian, declared that it had the right to nullify a tariff law passed by Congress. President Andrew Jackson reacted furiously. He was not fond of his vice president at all, and he moved troops in place to enforce the law outside South Carolina, while at the same time moving Congress toward a compromise position on the tariff which addressed some of South Carolina's grievances. Tocqueville describes some of this process in Democracy in America. Tocqueville also coincided with another national policy that had a significant regional effect, and that was Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, something he considered very important. The forced movement of what we now call the 5 civilized tribes over what has come to be called the Trail of Tears from the southeastern states to what is now Oklahoma. And Tocqueville, on his western travels, actually witnessed some of the Indians moving west in this movement, and he wrote a chapter at the end of the first volume of Democracy in America on the position of Indians and blacks in America and what the problems that posed for the country. These issues foreshadowed crises that came later and illustrated problems which Tocqueville addressed in the last chapters of the first volume of Democracy in America, on the fact that blacks and Indians were not considered citizens in this democratic republic. He foresaw the possibility of the rupture of the Civil War. It's one of his many uncanny predictions. He looks ahead, this young man writing in his 20s and 30s, looks ahead and sees much of the future history that has happened. He sees the possibility of the rupture of civil war and the tragic fate of many Native Americans, even as he saluted the way democracy bound citizens together through local government. And perhaps he may even be seen as having pointed to the successes of the civil rights movement when he writes, "To combat the evils that equality can produce, there is only one efficacious remedy. It is political freedom." But the habits of the heart, another Tocqueville phrase, fostered by involvement in local government, also did something else. And here we encountered a second reason Americans avoided the isolationism of the individual, or what Tocqueville calls individualism. And incidentally, I gather that that was his use of the term individualism is one of the first times that word enters the French and English languages. He coins words as well as ideas that had occurred to no one before. To the contrary, Americans were busy starting thousands of voluntary associations, of creating civil society, mediating institutions between individuals and government, institutions through which individuals could affect government or could change society without involving government at all. And Tocqueville paints this, in one passage, he paints this picture of a busy people constantly involved in political activity and voluntary associations. Scarcely have you descended on that on the soil of America, he writes, when you find yourself in the midst of a sort of turmoil. A confused clamor is raised on all sides. 1,000 voices come to your ears at the same time, each of them expressing some social needs. And I think some of his French aristocratic readers are here kind of saying, oh, doesn't sound good here. This is a problem, all these people agitating. Around you, everything moves. Here, the people of one neighborhood have gathered to learn if a church ought to be built. There, they are working on the choice of a representative. Farther on, the deputies of a district are going to town in all haste in order to decide about some local improvements. In another place, the farmers of a village abandon their furrows to go discuss the plan of a road or school. Citizens assemble with the sole goal of declaring that they disapprove of the course of government, whereas others gather to proclaim that the men in place are the fathers of their country. Here are others still who, regarding drunkenness as the principal source of the evils of the state, come solemnly to pledge themselves to give an example of temperance. There is a note of astonishment here, I think, and particularly in that last sentence where the wine-drinking French aristocrat contemplates the possibilities of the prohibition of alcohol. Tocqueville arrived in America at a time when voluntary associations were championing causes that ultimately transformed the nation. And often involving government, but often not involving government, often changing the habits of the heart. They were particularly common, these associations, in New England, in upstate New York, which had been settled by New England Yankees, where Tocqueville spent a large part of his visit. Nearly half of his visit was in that northern tier of states. The Yankee, as Orestes Bronson noted, tends to be, quote, restless in body and mind, always scheming, always in motion, never satisfied with what he has, and always seeking to make the world like himself or as uneasy as himself. And David Hackett Fisher, the great historian, author of Albion's Seed, 4 British folkways made their way from the British Isles to the different American colonies, notes that the New Englanders who were isolated in their own colonies for 200 years and then spread across the northern part of the country, they were moralistic and intolerant. They believed in following their moral principles and in making other people do it too, persuading them if possible, but using powers of government if indeed. Tocqueville clearly admired, on balance, the reformist Yankee impulse as an example of democratic Americans working together in voluntary associations to improve their society. And one of these efforts, as he notes, was the temperance movement, which ultimately persuaded the nation to embark on a dozen years of the noble experiment of prohibiting alcohol. That experiment failed, but in Tocqueville's time, the temperance movement did vastly reduce alcohol consumption by something like 2/3 average alcohol consumption in this country. In what one historian, speaking of the period before which Tocqueville arrived, entitled a book, The Alcoholic Republic. The consumption of whiskey was very high, and there is not a total lack of correlation with the average consumption of whiskey and the number of duels that people were participating in. This was a pretty lusty and go-get-em society, and the temperance movement had a big effect on the behavior of Americans. Another movement that was soon to begin was the women's rights movement, which resulted in another amendment to the Constitution granting women the vote. Tocqueville, the Frenchman, whose wife, by the way, was English, but had French attitudes, Tocqueville was astonished to note that, quote, women themselves often go to political assemblies and by listening to political discourses take a rest from household tedium. We're now in a period in our history where, to take one example, Hillary Clinton is doing something other than taking a rest from household tedium. She's serving as 2 women recently before has served as Secretary of State. But Tocqueville sees this movement. I'm not sure that he entirely approves, but he observes it. He sees something. This is not something In France, in aristocratic France, women could exercise a behind-the-scenes influence in the boudoir, but they were not seen in the course of formal public debate. America was something different. Another movement that was beginning to gain adherence was abolitionism, the move to abolish slavery and the increasing defense of slavery by white Southerners. Just a few years before Tocqueville's journey, a state constitutional convention in Virginia, I've referenced John Randolph Roanoke's remarks at that convention, had narrowly rejected a provision to gradually abolish slavery, as all the states geographically to the north had done. And it's tantalizing to contemplate how history would have unfolded if that decision had gone the other way. In the North, most Americans considered abolitionists fanatics who would disrupt the Union. 1830s. They were considered extremists. But the abolitionist cause had great moral power in a nation whose Declaration of Independence had begun with the words, "We hold it to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And there was also a tension between the existence of slavery and the moral equality in Christianity professed by almost all Americans. Christianity is a religion unlike the pagan religions which it replaced, which says that each individual has an immortal soul and is made in the image of God. This would have been an absolutely astonishing proposition to Aristotle, to the Roman philosophers, but it was part of the Christian heritage of America, and it was always in some tension with slavery. And one of the interesting things about Britain and America is that the impulse to end first the slave trade and then slavery itself was an impulse that was strongest in, most strongly advocated by evangelical Christians of the day and Quakers. It came out of religious belief. Those who see religious conservatives or religious people of any ideological disposition as a threat to democracy need to reflect on the fact that the movement to abolish slavery was a movement that began, as indeed much of the civil rights movement began, as a movement spurred by people with strong Christian impulses and that were at peace with some of the tenets that are at the heart of Christianity. And religion clearly impressed Tocqueville. He was from a country, France, in which everybody was technically Catholic but had gone through a revolution that was secular and anti-religious, where in the wake of that revolution, the Catholic Church had become an ally of the royal family instead of a kind of adversary to it as had been in the pre-revolutionary period, and in which the Church, Catholic Church nationally, internationally, in the form of the papacy, was explicitly hostile to democracy. And said that it was not a good system. So religion from Tocqueville, in Tocqueville's, from the perspective of the people among whom he had grown up, religion was the enemy of democracy. Tocqueville writes, "On my arrival in the country, it was the religious aspect of the country that first struck my eye. In contrast to the countries with established churches, and with monopolies of religious belief established by law or enforced by the state, Tocqueville notes the spirit, in those situations, he said, the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom must always move in contrary directions. But Americans had a different heritage. Britain's North American colonies started off with different religious traditions. Some of them were havens of people who were subject to religious persecution, including the Huguenots who settled in South Carolina after King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes and said that the Protestants would not be tolerated in his country. So the founders who understood this multivarious religious heritage provided in the Constitution there be no religious test for office in the federal government. And in the Bill of Rights, they provided that Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion, nor one prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This didn't mean an entire separation of church and state, although Tocqueville uses that phrase. During his visit to Massachusetts, still had an established church, which it supported by the taxing power, tax revenues of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That was abolished a couple of years later. But the But Tocqueville noted the paradox that, again, I think was something that he thought would astonish his French aristocratic readers. Diminishing the apparent force of a religion came to increase its real power. If people were not forced to attend and financially support a church, they would have more adherence to the church which they voluntarily supported, and its teachings would mean more to them. Tocqueville believed that religious belief was more prevalent and stronger in America than in France, and that Americans believe it necessary to the maintenance of republican institutions. So in his view, religion was not hostile to democracy and the republic. It was the friend and the support of democracy and the republic. Religion, he writes, which among Americans never mixes directly in the government, should therefore be considered as the first of their political institutions. For if it does not give them the taste for freedom, it singularly facilitates their use of it. Religious belief, he could observe, was the impulse behind the movements for temperance and women's rights and abolition of slavery. It was an impulse which gave strength to the observation of limits of the powers on the state. And indeed, we're just debating in our politics of today an issue involving what power should the state have over the free exercise of religious beliefs by individuals and by organizations they establish to work together, which have a religious basis. It gave strength. Religion gives strength to the observation of the limits of power on the state and the limits on the power of temporary voting majorities. At the same time that the law permits the American people to do everything, Tocqueville writes, religion prevents them from conceiving everything and forbids them to dare anything. So instead of having external state limitations, you have individual self-restraint and group self-restraint through groups in which people voluntarily associate. Religions could produce movements that could be described as liberal or liberating, but it also fostered a stubborn conservatism that would prevent the excesses and the despotism produced by the anti-religious French Revolution with its bloody executions and its defiance of due process of law. Tocqueville also saw that religion and law also combined to produce material prosperity, another conservatizing effect, if you will, of the American system. One is astonished by the growing prosperity of the people, he writes at one point. In the 2 decades before Tocqueville's visit, Americans had been building canals. He traveled on a number of them. And just before he arrived, the first tracks of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were being laid down. Steamboats were plying the Mississippi River with disastrous safety records, as he noted. Mark Twain and Life on the Mississippi gives you an idea what those were like a couple of decades later. Travel times and transportation costs were being hugely reduced, and internal trade hugely increased. It's hard to overestimate the difference that it made. I mean, New York was closer in travel time to Europe than it was to my home state of Michigan before the completion of the Erie Canal. After the Erie Canal and lake travel, steamboat travel through Lake Erie, suddenly products, goods produced in Michigan can be transported to New York, where they can be disseminated around the East Coast into different domestic markets or shipped abroad at hugely decreased costs. So you're spreading capitalist economic activity across the country, and the internal trade in the country is hugely increased. The frontier farmers or people near that are no longer living in a situation where they can expect to be totally self-sufficient in goods and services their whole lives. They're being part of an economy that's being knit together. At the same time, American merchants were plying the Atlantic, carrying on the China trade. American whaling vessels were pursuing their prey in the South Pacific. You can read Melville's wonderful Moby Dick about that, and don't skip the whale chapters. They're actually kind of interesting about that. That travel. You know, we have an image from some 20th century political rhetoric that Americans before World War I or World War II, at some point in the early 20th century, that Americans before that were isolationists, were penned up in their own country. That simply isn't true. What you saw were you had merchant ties all over the world, and some of these were immensely profitable. I mean, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, the mother of President Franklin Roosevelt, her father, Warren Delano, made 2 China voyages in the China trade, and sometime not much longer after Tocqueville came to America. He retired after that at the age of 31 and built a castle on the Hudson River. And the family was rich ever since off the profits from that kind of trade. That was America traveling around the world. And in the decades after Tocqueville, it starts about his time, you also have American churches sending missionaries around the world. Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898, but the missionaries were there in the 1820s. And so the religious impulse which Tocqueville traces in America is one that America is also tracing in the world. And so that Tocqueville doesn't, I believe, mention this development. This is the kind of activity, the hyperactivity that this country is producing, this country with its multiple religions, its very thin federal government, its strong belief in its increasing transportation and communication as the telegraph comes in the 1840s, and its ability to basically cut space and time in half. So this buzzing activity that Tocqueville is describing in America is also penetrating in various ways around the world. Within the country, Americans are moving westward in vast numbers. They're creating new New Englands, and they've done so in upstate New York, in northeast Ohio, in Michigan, where Tocqueville was there when it was the Michigan Territory, scarcely settled. 10 years later, it was a state 6 years later, and filled up largely with New England Yankee stock people from upstate New York. You had Pennsylvanians going sort of directly west from Philadelphia. So they go to Cincinnati, where if you look at the downtown street grid and adjust it to the side, you will see that the street names are almost exactly the same as Center City, Philadelphia. They've copied the street grid. And the accent, local accent in Cincinnati, to the extent it persists, is very much like the local accent in Philadelphia. They sort of say ut instead of oat and things, and so forth. They're going directly. The New England Yankees are very much setting up these voluntary associations, making a lot of noise, moralistic. The Philadelphians, coming kind of from the Quaker tradition, are more quiet. They're tolerant of corruption outside their own circle, but they insist on moral behavior within it. They're part of the anti-slavery movement, too. And in the South, you've got the great movement of slaveholders and of the slaves themselves across from the Atlantic states. Virginia becomes a state exporting slaves in large number. South Carolina, many of the great planters in South Carolina are buying plantation land from which the Indians have been expelled recently in Alabama and Mississippi, and building huge plantations, so that Charleston in many ways is the richest significant city on per capita wealth, at least of the free population at the time of the beginning of the Civil War, and the richest county in the United States by that measure is Adams County, Mississippi, which the county seat is Natchez on the Mississippi, cotton lands on the Mississippi River. This is a westward migration for the slaves, for the African Americans. That migration involved really more people than moving people across the Atlantic, and it was also a huge trauma. I mean, slaves were taken, families were taken apart, they were taken away from their churches, where, the authentic, which are, the kind of worship that you can hear in black American churches today, I think, is one of our closest connections with how people actually lived in the 18th century. It's a tradition that's been carried on for a long time with a hugely strong musical tradition, which has been related in our popular music. But you also had this sort of huge trauma of people being moved across the country in a variety of ways. Tocqueville saw the slave market in New Orleans. He saw this stuff that was going on. As I say, he was concerned about it. And at the same time, he could hardly not but be impressed by the huge economic growth, by the bustle and change, by the vigor of this somewhat disorganized, very much decentralized, but also vital and free and productive country. And he was eerily prescient about the future. As I said, he foresaw the possibility of civil war, but he thought the North could not subdue a South bent on independence, which I as I look back, was probably true when he wrote, since the North's victory 30 years later depended on the industrialization and the vast population growth that occurred between his time and the Civil War, between 1831 and 1861. Tocqueville mused in one of his last chapters in Volume 1 about the possibility that the world in the 20th century would be dominated by two great powers, one democratic and one despotic, America and Russia. Hit the spot again, didn't he? He foresaw that a democratic nation could descend into what he called a soft despotism. In that, he anticipated the conservative critique of many of the public policies of the last 100 years. And it's about this critique and Tocqueville's thing that I want to speak about now. Tocqueville's vivid picture of soft despotism appears almost abruptly at the end of the second volume of Democracy in America. The picture he has painted up to that point is a picture of a democratic America is not entirely complimentary. He takes it for granted that democratic America cannot produce the high culture or fine arts fostered by aristocratic nations like France, which is was certainly true in the 19th century, with all due regard for our artists and writers, who we did have some pretty good ones, but people are still buying Louis Vuitton luggage and Chanel perfume and things. France does have that sort of high arts knack for that was there. He says more generally that a democratic society is less likely than an aristocratic one to value excellence, more likely to tolerate mediocrity. Maybe so. He thinks democracy is more benign in America than it would be in France because it's not the product of a violent revolution which leaves classes divided against each other, but rather springs naturally from a society that was never very aristocratic to begin with. And I think that's a prognostication that can be defended if I had time to go in some of the history of Europe. But on the whole, as we've seen, he's positive about what he sees. And he's writing, remember, for an audience that he thinks doesn't like America, doesn't like democracy, and is prepared to see it as a threat. Tocqueville sees Americans overcoming the dangers of individualism by their involvement in local self-government and by their proclivity to create and work in voluntary associations, or the little platoons in Edmund Burke's phrase. He sees religion and the non-privileged place of different churches and sects in America as tending to produce virtuous behavior and to place limits on destructive impulses. He sees an America bursting with prosperity, resourceful in commerce, creative in imagination. But he also sees a threat. The things which have produced America's success could in time produce a future much gloomier and could keep democratic America from living up to its potential. And I think I want to quote at some length some of the things he was saying and intersperse it with my own comments because I can't really improve on Tocqueville's prose. I do not fear that in their chiefs Americans will find tyrants, he says, but rather schoolmasters in this phrase. Not a hard despotism, but a soft despotism. I think that, therefore, the kind of oppression with which democratic peoples are threatened will resemble nothing that has preceded it in the world. Our contemporaries would not find its image in their memories. I myself seek in vain an expression that exactly reproduces the idea that I form of it for myself and that contains it. The old words despotism and tyranny are not suitable. The thing is new, therefore I must try to define it since I cannot name it. I want to imagine with what new features despotism could be produced in the world. I see an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who resolve without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Each of them, withdrawn and apart, is like a stranger to the destiny of all the others. His children and his particular friends form the whole human species for him. This is the individualism again. As for dwelling with his fellow citizen, he is beside them, but he does not see them. He touches them and does not feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself alone, and if a family remains for him, one can at least say he no longer has a native country. And it's a view, in other words, in which the forces that he sees as holding people together and avoiding the threat of isolation and individualism is a threat to America. And he's writing about an America, he's presaging here, I think, an America that is much larger than he's describing here. When Tocqueville came here, Paris had 800,000 people. America's largest city, New York, had 200,000. Charleston, 30,000. the second largest city in the South after New Orleans. Over the next century, industrialization and vast immigration changed that demography hugely. By 1912, 100 years ago, New York had 5 million people, Chicago 2 million, Philadelphia 1.5 million, although Charleston was still down there with only 58,000. And you'd had these vast waves of immigration, starting from Ireland and Germany in the 1840s, which were different cultures. Many of these immigrants were Catholics in a mostly Protestant country that was suspicious of Catholics. You had immigration from the 1890s. You start having a lot of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, which is very alarming to many Americans. We have as many as, the year 1907, 1,200,000 immigrants arrive in a country of 86 million. That's as much immigration as we've had in the last decade annually in a country of more than 3 times that size. So you're talking about a huge inundation of people who come with strange languages, strange mores. They work in garment sweatshops and steel and assembly lines. These are people who end up owning no property. They rent their homes, often don't even have bank accounts. The workmen are paid with cash in a pay envelope or with a check that they cash at the bar outside the factory, and the wives line up outside the factory gate to get the check before they go into the bar and stand drinks for everybody. But it's America. The property holders' democracy that we seem to be in 1830 suddenly is not a property holders' democracy anymore. We've suffered what Robert Nisbet calls a loss of community. As Robert Putnam, the sociologist, recently found to his dismay, he didn't want to report it, the parts of America today with the greatest ethnic and racial diversity are also the part with the highest degree of lack of trust in others and participation in voluntary associations. Tocqueville was looking forward, I think, here to a threat that in a differently kind of America, you would have a superintending government creating soft despotism that would break the ties between individuals and put them in a situation of isolation, of individualism. And he describes this process in these words. Above these, an immense tutelary power is elevated, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had for its object to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves. It willingly works for their happiness, but it wants to be the unique agent and sole arbiter of that. It provides for their security, foresees and secures their needs, facilitates their pleasures, conducts their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their estate, divides their inheritance. Can it not take away from them entirely the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? So it is that every day it renders the employment of free will less useful and more rare. It confines the action of the will in a smaller space and little by little steals the very use of it from the citizen. Equality has prepared men for all these things. It has disposed them to tolerate them and even to regard them as a benefit. And I think here Tocqueville is providing 80 or 100 years, 80 years before the progressive movement, 100 years before the New Deal, the conservative critique and credential of these programs. It is not simply that they are economically harmful, that they tend to deter economic activity, prosperity, and economic growth. It is their effect on the character of people, the effect that a superintending government that tends to try to protect you from all damage and provide perfect security, one that's run by a centralized bureaucratic apparatus, run by alleged experts, justified by the supposed inability of ordinary people to take care of themselves and navigate the shoals and reefs of an advanced industrial democracy. This soft despotism tends to destroy human character. This despotism that assumes that people are incompetent children, in treating them like that, tends to make them behave like that and be like that. Tocqueville, in an earlier passage, described the possibility that something far worse can come into existence, a very hard despotism or tyranny that would try to take over the operation of every institution of society and to abolish freedoms of speech and religion. In other words, he foresees 20th century totalitarianism. And he clearly states that soft despotism is better than that. But he goes on to insist to describe how it will have a bad effect on people's character and that it will tend to eradicate the aspects of American character that he saw as producing virtue in the democratic America of the 1830s. He writes, "Thus, after taking each individual by turn in its powerful hands and kneading him as it likes, the sovereign extends its arms over society as a whole. It covers its surface with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules, bureaucracy, through which the most original minds and the most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not break wills, but it softens them, bends them, and directs them. It rarely forces one to act, but it constantly opposes itself to one as acting. It does not destroy, it prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is a shepherd. I have always believed that this sort of regulated, mild, and peaceful servitude, whose picture I have just painted, could be combined better than one imagines with some external forms of freedom, and that it would not be impossible for it to be established in the very shadow of the sovereignty of the people." And stop to consider a moment what he's talking, that he's describing a democratic people as a herd of timid and industrial animals. What this reminds me of is the ideas of progressive education, which have dominated the education schools and much of our public school system since the 1920s. The tutelary power of the teachers' colleges and lately the teacher unions. These are people who have taken the place of the local authorities who superintended the public schools for which most of the century after Tocqueville wrote, and tended to require a more rigorous course of study and one that emphasized the special character of American life as described by Tocqueville. But the aim of progressive education is not to produce excellence. Not to enable people to rise in life. They don't really like that very much. They want to teach basic arithmetic. They want to teach people enough and give them enough sense of absorbing the discipline of the ringing bells and the time clock so that they can work in Henry Ford's Model T factory and then vote for the kind of people that these people would like them to vote for. They could make enough money for food, clothing, and shelter, enough time for leisure, for radio or movies or TVs, facilitating their pleasures, as Tocqueville put it, and to endorse in their occasional vote, or as Tocqueville puts it, citizens leave their dependence for a moment to indicate their master and then re-enter it. That's how he sees the democratic process, the political process working in a system of soft despotism. In this view, he portrays a situation where we have gone far along the road to soft despotism and there is no turning around. I want to suggest something a little different, something that's, from my point of view, a little more optimistic. First of all, many of the features of America that Tocqueville describes are still part of American life. America still abounds in voluntary associations more than any other nation in the world. There are some indications the percentage of people involved in such associations are declining, as Robert Putnam suggested in his book, Bowling Alone, but I think there's some important countervailing evidence that's come forward. So voluntary associations are part of American life. Americans give more money and volunteer more time for charity than people in any other significant nation in the world, and by a lot. Arthur Brooks, the president of American Enterprise Institute, has documented this. It's part of an American tradition. The tradition of American philanthropy is still strong. Remember that a century ago, in that progressive era, masters of great fortune like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller gave enormous sums to charity and changed American life through building our system of libraries. Rockefeller created our medical research institutions and the rigorous medical schools that we have today and the teaching hospitals. That was the creation of John D. Rockefeller, a contribution to American life that was above that of many government policies and government programs. So the federal government does not have, the tutelary power does not have a monopoly in many areas. And we've still got philanthropy. And Bill Gates is trying to be a smart philanthropist, and he's done some dumb things, and he's taken metrics, and he's trying to do better. So we do have a vital philanthropic thing. And in two important respects, I think we still remain an exceptional nation in the way that Tocqueville was the first to recognize. One is that we're still, by and large, a religious people and a people who are respectful of the religion of others. There's a large increasing percentage of people that identify themselves as unbelievers. It is still very low. The sociologists and sophisticateds that predicted that Europe has gone secular and the United States, when it advances enough, will go secular too, have simply been proven wrong by events. If anything, forms of sort of strengthened religion that demand greater devotion from their followers have gained strength at the risk at the expense of religions whose doctrines have become undifferentiable from the George McGovern platform in the 1972 presidential election. Second way that we've remained an exceptional nation, as we were at Tocqueville's time. Arguably, we're not a century ago in the progressive era, but I would submit are again, is that we're a property owner's democracy. Most Americans in the course of their working lives accumulate significant amounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property in the form of real estate and financial estimates. We're in an economic downturn period now, by no means the most severe in our history, but the fact that most Americans, I believe, continue to look forward to, and with good reason, to accumulated property means that they're less likely to sign up to be a member of a herd of timid industrial animals. Finally, I believe a case can be made that American voters have not supinely ratified the creation of soft despotism. They've tended to resist it. When parties in power have tried to expand the size and scope of government, they've been sharply rebuked by the voters. Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, an attempted abolition of Congress's prerogative of declaring war, was rebuked by the record majority cast for Warren G. Harding's return to normalcy in 1920. Franklin Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court and New Deal's governors' refusal to enforce the law against illegal sit-down strikes was rebuked in the elections of 1938 and subsequent years, which produced anti-New Deal Congresses for 20 years. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society was soundly rebuked in the elections of 1966 and 68, and the stagflation that prevailed during Jimmy Carter's presidency produced a 44-state landslide for Ronald Reagan in 1980. The two most recent Democratic presidents, after raising taxes and advancing a national health care plan, were both rebuked sharply by record Republican victories in the off-year elections of 1994 and 2010. Now, many conservative thinkers, the pessimists, would reply that these victories did not change the trajectory of public policy, that creeping socialism just kept creeping. There's something to this, but I think the argument's overstated. Tax rates were vastly cut, and wartime nationalization of railroads and shipyards was ended after 1920. And by the way, the latter policy was not repeated in the next World War. The Republican Congress elected in 1946 rejected New Deal policies for national health insurance, federal aid to education, government dominance of the housing industry. It ended wartime wage and price controls and significantly restricted the power of labor unions. These public policies were enduring, some for a generation, some to this day, and they led to post-war prosperity when almost everybody expected a return to depression. The elections rejecting the Great Society led over the next 20 years, administrations of both parties, to deregulation of transportation and communications, which squeezed huge costs out of services, kind of like the transportation communication revolutions that happened on either side of Tocqueville's visit, that enabled Americans to live much better and to be much more productive. And in the 1990s, we saw a vast decrease in welfare dependency and crime, resulting almost entirely from the pioneering efforts of reformers at state and local governments, subsidiarity. Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani leading the way, and imitated and adapted by the leaders of many other states and cities, most of them Republicans, but many of them Democrats as well, and in which the federal government was basically an interested and occasionally helpful bystander. The 2010 elections have not yet been followed by major public policy reversals, but could be depending on the outcome of the elections this year. And we do know that the president's health care law, which he expected to be popular, has instead become so unpopular that he barely mentioned it in his State of the Union address last month. Silence tells you a lot in that situation. Let me let Tocqueville have the last word. The aristocrat who was so alert to the strengths of democracy, even while keenly identifying its weaknesses, was a man of piercing intelligence. And to read him, you really have to read him slowly and take in a little bit. Someone of my acquaintance has Tocqueville on her Kindle to read a chapter or so every so often, and to ponder, because often single paragraphs have insights that could produce a whole academic career for most people. But this extraordinary man, though he's one of the great thinkers of our age, of any age, a person whose piercing intelligence is so much greater than that of almost anybody who has ever tried to do what he tried to do, at the same time also has a faith in the capacity of ordinary people to, in the right circumstances, govern themselves and contribute to the building of a decent and virtuous society. Those who advocated the course of what he calls soft despotism lack this faith. They see ordinary people as incapable of self-governance, in need of a shepherd to guide the herd the right direction. Tocqueville sees us ordinary mortals, so far below him, as something better. Nobody says it better than himself. Let me conclude with the final passage of the second volume of Democracy in America. As for myself, having come to the final stage of my course, to discover from afar, but at once, all the diverse objects that I had contemplated separately in advancing, I feel full of fears and full of hopes. I see great perils that it is possible to ward off, great evils that one can avoid or restrain, and I become more and more firm in the belief that to be honest and prosperous, it is still enough for democratic nations to wish it. I am not unaware that several of my contemporaries have thought that peoples are never masters of themselves here below, and that they necessarily obey, I do not know which insurmountable and unintelligent force born of previous events, the race, the soil, or the climate. Those are false and cowardly doctrines that can never produce any but weak men and pusillanimous nations. Providence has not created the human race, either entirely independent or perfectly slave. It traces, it is true, a fatal circle around each man that he cannot leave. But within its vast limits, man is powerful and free. So are societies. Nations of our day cannot have it, that conditions within them are not equal, but it depends on them whether equality leads to servitude or to freedom, to enlightenment or barbarism, to prosperity or misery. Thank you.